There are periods in history when people face death not from arrows or swords, nor from the fangs of wild beasts, nor even from a clearly identifiable plague. Instead, they perished, slowly, painfully, and in what seemed like an utterly inexplicable manner, victims of the very sustenance laid before them on their daily tables. Imagine yourself stepping into a small English alehouse in the 12th century, merely seeking a hearty meal and a restorative drink, enough to sustain you until tomorrow. Yet, what awaited you in that cramped, smoky room could plunge you into delirium, erode your teeth, poison your body, and, in the most dreadful cases, blacken your hands and feet until they withered and fell away, all for a simple loaf of bread. This is no sensational detail concocted by later generations, but a cold, hard historical truth. The deeper one delves into the world of the medieval alehouse, the more chillingly apparent it becomes. The very place that nourished English society for centuries was also capable of snatching lives with the most commonplace, familiar items. To truly comprehend medieval life, one need not begin with grand castles or brutal battlefields. Start instead with the cup on the table, the simmering pot of stew, and the seemingly innocuous loaf of bread. It is there that history truly reveals its visceral, unvarnished face. Similarly, history records places not obliterated by war, nor vanished due to earthquakes, floods, or fires. They endured long enough to witness their inhabitants inadvertently poisoning themselves with what appeared to be the most harmless of things. And if there is one such place that should make you pause with a shiver, it is those chillingly named hospitals that once dotted medieval Europe, the hospitals of the dismembered. Name alone is gruesome enough, but the spectacle awaiting you at their gates was far more horrific. Above the entrance, amputated arms, legs, and fingers of the very patients within hung suspended grim offerings to Saint Anthony, the patron saint of those afflicted with a disease known across Europe by an equally terrifying name, Saint Anthony's fire. The cause of this appalling illness was not war, not pestilence, nor even the wrath of God. It was bread, an ordinary loaf of rye bread, consumed in an ordinary alehouse on an ordinary day. The only difference was that within the grain lurked a deadly fungus. Ground into flour and baked, it transformed a simple meal into a death sentence. Those who consumed it could suffer convulsions, delirium, hallucinations, and gangrene, watching as their fingertips, toes, and even entire limbs slowly died, blackened, and detached from their bodies. A single outbreak in France in 994 is estimated to have claimed between 20 and 40,000 lives. By the end of the 15th century, the monks dedicated to treating this disease had established some 370 specialized hospitals across Europe. But perhaps the most horrifying aspect was that for centuries, no one truly understood the real cause behind this widespread tragedy. And, with a cruel irony, at the very same time, this self-same bread was considered one of the safer times items you could consume in a medieval English alehouse. Now, let us truly step into the 12th century. You have just pushed open the door of a public alehouse in medieval England. The ceiling is low, the room cramped, dense with smoke, dim, stuffy, and nestled within an actual home where the woman of the house brewed ale, slept, ate, raised her children, and even housed livestock, all within a single, confined space. Beneath your feet is an earth floor, exhaling a thick, pungent mix of sweat, animal dung, fermenting yeast, and wood smoke. All this activity is packed into a room, perhaps no more than 23 to 30 square meters, smaller than many modern studio flats. And in that space, you'd find not just the family and their animals, but also you and your neighbors, all gathered to quench a thirst. Outside was hardly better. The streets were open sewers, where human waste, rubbish, and rotting animal carcasses floated in rivers and ditches. Excavations in York have revealed a startling truth. Anglo-Saxons routinely dug their water wells and cesspits just a few steps apart. That single detail alone speaks volumes about medieval England's fragile, almost non-existent, understanding of pollution and hygiene. average life expectancy at birth for boys in landed well-to-do families was a mere 31 years. If you were a poor peasant, that average dropped even further, to around 30, and the food and drink offered in your local alehouse were not designed to help you defy those grim statistics. They were simply meant to keep you alive until tomorrow. Sadly, all too often, they failed even at that. To understand why an English alehouse could be a death trap, one must first grasp what ale represented to the people of that era. It was not a recreational drink, nor a luxury. For them, ale was survival. Grain so dominated the medieval English diet that it is almost unfathomable today. Scholars estimate that agricultural laborers derived around 80% of their total calories from grain. For soldiers, that figure was approximately 75%. Even the nobility, despite their abundance of meat and imported luxuries, still obtained around 65% of their calories from grain-based foods. And these essential calories primarily came in three forms: bread, pottage, a thick stew, and ale. Ale was not something you savored after a long day's work to unwind. It was one of the three foundational pillars that prevented medieval English life from collapsing. People called it liquid bread, and they were not exaggerating. Men, women, children, monks, soldiers, peasants, nobles, everyone drank ale daily. The common consumption rate was about 1 gallon per person per day, equivalent to nearly 4 litres. Monks at Westminster Abbey were rationed precisely that amount. In 1272, a retired couple at Selby Abbey received 2 gallons of ale daily, along with 3 loaves of bread. Henry Deasy's household purchased an average of 85 gallons of ale daily in 1299. Framlingham Castle consumed 78 gallons a day in 1385. These were not rare exceptions. This was the accepted norm. This ale bore almost no resemblance to modern beer. It contained no hops, as hops were only introduced to England from the late 15th century onwards. Instead, it was brewed from grain, water, and yeast, then bittered with a mixture of herbs known as gruit. The finished product was typically thick, sweet, cloudy, and usually had an alcohol content below 3%. The alcohol primarily served as a preservative, not as an intoxicant. Lacking hops, a highly effective natural preservative, ale spoilt incredibly quickly. An Anglo-Saxon writer once bluntly described that after 2 days, only the bravest or most foolish in the village would still dare to drink the ale. Otherwise, it was fit only for pigs. Indeed, stale ale was often used as pig swill. And then there was the matter of cost. An unskilled labourer, in 1310, earned at most about 1.5 pence a day. Meanwhile, a single gallon of ale could easily consume almost that entire day's wage. This meant that when you sat down and ordered a gallon of ale, you were not doing so for idle pleasure. You were spending nearly your entire daily income on your most crucial source of nutrition. If that ale went bad, you didn't just lose money. You lost a meal, and with it, your very survival. The person brewing this life-sustaining ale was, more often than not, a woman. England's immense demand for ale was met by thousands of brewers, the majority of whom were women. They were known as alewives or brewsters. This was one of the very few professions truly open to medieval women, granting them a significant position within the economy. The housewife would brew ale for her family as a regular chore, then sell any surplus to earn extra income. Since most of the population was illiterate, they would typically hang various markers outside their doors: a broom, a shovel, a ladle, or a carved wooden animal to signal that fresh ale was ready. Many alehouses did not have a fixed location. Villages, people simply went to the home of whoever had just finished a new batch of ale. Some talented women built thriving careers from this trade. Yet, history has also treated them harshly. Many historians note an unsettling overlap between the imagery of the alewife and that of the witch in later centuries. The bubbling cauldron, the black cat, the pointy hat, and the broom hanging outside the door. While the connection remains debated, the pattern is hard to ignore. The women who nourished England were, in many cases, later stigmatized and accused of malevolence by society. In 1540, the city of Chester even enacted a ban on women aged 14 to 40 from selling ale, fearing they would use their charms to spread depravity. A profession that had sustained women for centuries was gradually stripped away, decree by decree, rite by rite. But the identity of the brewer was perhaps not as terrifying as what actually lurked in your cup. Before hops were introduced to England, Gruyt, a blend of herbs, was used to bitter and flavour ale. 3 common varieties were bog myrtle, yarrow, and wild rosemary. Some scholars describe Gruyt ale in terms that would make any modern food safety inspector immediately resign. Intensely intoxicating, narcotic, aphrodisiac, and even mind-altering if consumed in sufficient quantities. Unlike hops, which have a mild sedative effect, many Gruyt herbs were potent stimulants. They didn't calm you. On the contrary, they made you tense and overexcited. Yarrow was believed to cause dizziness, ringing in the ears, and even madness if consumed in large quantities. Bog myrtle, according to some sources, was historically used by Norse warriors to induce hallucinations and send themselves into a battle frenzy before combat. Then there was henbane, a black nightshade plant from the Solanaceae family, truly poisonous, yet deliberately added to ale in many parts of Europe to enhance the perceived intoxicating effect. Remnants of a Celtic beer recipe over 2,000 years old, found in modern Germany, still contain henbane. Demand was so great that entire gardens were cultivated solely for this herb. In low doses, henbane created a mild psychoactive effect, making the beer seem stronger than it was. In higher doses, it could cause delirium, hallucinations, nausea, and, worse still, lead to death. The German Brewers Association once admitted that, before modern regulations were enacted, beer was often adulterated with all manner of alarming substances: henbane, thornapple, wood shavings, roots, soot, and even pine resin. If the brewer miscalculated the dosage, at best the customer would pass out from intoxication or mild poisoning. At worst, that gulp of beer could be their last. More remarkably, henbane also had a side effect of causing dry mouth. This meant that after drinking a mug of henbane-laced ale, your first reflex would be to desire another. He had inadvertently, or perhaps not so inadvertently, created a self-perpetuating sales mechanism long before the world had a concept of marketing. But everything I have just described has only concerned the drinks. We have not even begun to address the food. The plate before you was, in fact, no plate at all. It was a trencher, a thick, large slice of stale bread used as a base for your food. You would eat your main course upon it. Then at the end of the meal, you could either consume the bread, now soaked in meat juices and sauces, or give it to the poor. Food was typically served in communal dishes placed in the center of the table, and diners would reach for it with their bare hands, sometimes using shared spoons or serving forks. Your drinking vessel was usually a jack, a type of leather tankard, lined with pitch or beeswax to prevent leakage. Continental Europeans often viewed leather cups as a sign of barbarism and uncivilized conduct. Frankly, on this occasion, they were not wrong. The staple food here was pottage, a thick stew made from grains, beans, vegetables, and occasionally meat. The greatest strength of pottage was also its most terrifying aspect. The stew pot could hang over the fire for days on end. Today, a portion would be eaten. Tomorrow, new ingredients would be added. And the cycle continued, without the pot ever being fully emptied or thoroughly washed. What you consumed on a Thursday might bear little resemblance to what someone ate on a Monday, yet it all came from a continuously bubbling pot that had been stewing long enough that you probably didn't want to contemplate its origins or hygiene. The type of grain you ate was strictly dependent on your social class. Barley, oats, and rye were for the poor. Wheat was expensive and reserved for the more affluent. The most common meats were pork, chicken, and other fowl. However, on many days of the week, particularly Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays, religious fasting laws prohibited the consumption of meat. Bread was so vital that it left its mark on the very language. The word Lord originates from the meaning keeper of the bread, while lady derives from maker of the bread. But bread also literally wore people down. Flour ground on millstones always contained fine grit from the grinding stones, which could not be entirely filtered out. People consumed these tiny fragments of stone daily, gradually grinding their teeth down to dull, weakened stumps. Analysis of 14th and 15th century skeletal remains reveals widespread malnutrition, and rickets was far from uncommon. And bread could betray you in far quicker ways too. In 14th century London, bakers were caught adulterating bread with dirt and chalk, and even embedding iron rods into loaves to illegally increase their weight. The Assize of Bread and Ale, enacted around 1266 under Henry III, was the first English statute to regulate the production and sale of food. Its enforcement was anything but lenient. The concept of a baker's dozen 13 loaves instead of 12 originated from this era, as bakers would add an extra loaf to avoid being accused of short waiting and facing severe penalties. But no law could protect you from ergot fungus on rye. When infected grain was harvested, milled, and baked into bread, the consumer became a victim of what was called St. Anthony's fire. One form of the disease attacked the nervous system, causing convulsions, hallucinations, and painful spasms. The other led to gangrene, cutting off blood supply to the extremities, causing fingers, toes, hands, and feet to gradually blacken and then drop off. The earliest records from 857 describe an epidemic with repulsive blisters that caused limbs to loosen and fall off before the victims died. Those who survived were often severely disabled for life. A young French nobleman, after narrowly escaping death from this disease, believed that the relics of St. Anthony had saved his life. He and his father established a monastic order dedicated to treating the victims, and by the end of the 15th century, this network of hospitals had spread across Europe. Above the hospital gates, amputated gangrenous limbs hung, both as a silent prayer and as a gruesome warning. What makes everything even more chilling is that ergot fungus is the natural source of lysergic acid, the chemical precursor to LSD. When medieval chroniclers reported that victims saw visions, they were not speaking in metaphors or allegories. They were genuinely experiencing terrifying biochemical hallucinations caused by the very bread they ate. It wasn't until 1670 that a French physician identified the link between diseased rye and this dreadful illness, and by 1676, it was officially confirmed. For over 800 relentless years, people ate bread, lost their limbs, and had no idea why. Found it far easier to believe that an enemy had poisoned their food than to consider that inert grain or the unhygienic hands of a brewer could be the culprit. Authorities did try to impose some order on this chaotic situation. They had ale conners officials who inspected the quality of bread, ale, and beer, and also fixed measures and prices. But tasting ale in those days was a perilous, often deadly, occupation. Spoiled ale could severely sicken the inspector, or even kill them, and even those considered reputable in the trade frequently engaged in fraud, selling unhealthy drinks, cheating on volume, charging unfair prices, and maintaining filthy brewing premises. In rural areas, where oversight was scarcer, the situation was even worse. Punishments for selling bad ale ranged from fines and public shaming before the villagers to potentially lethal measures like the ducking stool. By the 16th century, alehouses had proliferated across England. These were not just places for mere eating and drinking. They were venues for meetings, for making oaths, settling disputes, transferring property, paying debts, and even arranging marriages. A public declaration made under the roof of an alehouse could carry almost the same legal weight as one made in court. Church viewed the alehouse as a direct competitor in the struggle for the hearts, minds, and money of its parishioners. The alehouse was more than just a place to drink. It was a parallel social institution, a shadow court, an alternative church, and for centuries, the beating social heart of England. And that, for me, is what makes this story more memorable than its sheer gruesomeness. For the very thing that nourished a society could also subtly, silently destroy it from within. Medieval people did not live long because their systems were safe or secure. They survived because their bodies were resilient enough to endure for just one more day. Every meal was a gamble with fate. Every mug of ale was an act of blind faith in sheer luck. If you lived to 50, you had defied the odds that the majority of your neighbors never came close to reaching. If you had the misfortune of being born in 12th century England, and sought a meal and drink in an alehouse, you would find yourself in a room as cramped and stuffy as a stable, sharing the stifling air with livestock and strangers. Your meal would consist of a piece of hard, stale bread, and you'd likely share a communal dish, eating with your bare hands, as cutlery was a luxury. You'd drink a sweet, cloudy, fast-spoiling liquid that might well be laced with hallucinogenic herbs. Very bread on your table could contain chalk, dirt, grit, or an invisible fungus, potent enough to rot your limbs away weeks later. The stew simmering in the pot would have been boiling for days, indiscriminately absorbing anything that fell into it. Your leather mug would reek unpleasantly of pine tar, and your teeth would already be half worn down from chewing on stray grit. And for this truly appalling privilege, you would pay almost an entire day's wages. Yet, in fairness, the people brewing and cooking these perilous provisions, largely women working from their own homes, were simply striving for survival, just like everyone else. They possessed no knowledge of microbiology, understood nothing of fungal toxins, and operated without any standardized procedures. All they had was a legacy of oral tradition, the urgent imperative to earn a living, and a society that demanded they provide daily necessities. This context transforms the story from merely frightening into something profoundly thought-provoking. Not every historical hazard stemmed from malice or cruelty. Very often, it arose from a lack of understanding that had been normalized for so long that no one even bothered to question it. Perhaps a gentle but invaluable lesson for us today lies precisely there. When a society becomes accustomed to something for long enough, it begins to call it normal, even if that normal is quietly making people sick, sapping their strength, leaving them disabled, or leading to premature death. Medieval folk didn't know their bread could cause their limbs to fall off, nor that their daily drink could induce delirium, or that contaminated water pervaded their very existence. But we are different. We possess knowledge, standards, science, and choice. The critical question, then, is whether we are vigilant enough not to dismiss the importance of what enters our bodies every single day. Medieval Alehouse left England with its language, customs, social laws, and even the very bread that sustained it. But all of this was served in a room thick with the stench of animal pens and fraught with deadly risks. You drank because you had to. You ate because there was no other option. And if you survived, it wasn't because the system was effective, but because you were fortunate enough to withstand yet another round of punishment from daily life itself. The 12th century didn't ask if you enjoyed the experience. It asked only one thing: could you endure it? Perhaps it is for this very reason that the deeper I delve into the tapestry of medieval alehouses, the more I realize this isn't merely a tale of squalor, ignorance, or the distant horrors of the past. It is, in fact, a challenging and uncomfortable mirror held up to our present day. For people in any era tend to believe that the things they use daily must surely be safe, that what is accepted by the entire community cannot be truly dangerous, and that if everyone else lives this way, they too will be fine. History, however, has consistently proven the exact opposite. Familiarity has never been sufficient proof of harmlessness. Indeed, many of humanity's greatest catastrophes have often infiltrated daily life, disguised as utterly normal, seemingly innocuous habits. Reflecting on this narrative, what truly haunts me is not just the image of gangrenous limbs hanging outside hospitals, nor the idea of a loaf of bread capable of killing so slowly and cruelly. What is more deeply unsettling is the fact that for hundreds of years, an entire civilization existed amidst such a vortex of danger, without ever truly understanding what it was up against. They toiled diligently, ate, married, prayed, raised children, and eventually grew old in a world where even the most fundamental elements sustaining life could betray them at any moment. And it is this realization that has led me to understand that humanity's true progress lies not in the greater conveniences we enjoy today, but in our developed capacity to question and challenge what we once took for granted as normal and obvious. This, too, is the greatest value this story imparts to readers and listeners today. It reminds us that food safety, public sanitation, rigorous testing procedures, alongside medical knowledge and life sciences, are not things that came about naturally. All of them have been painstakingly built over centuries of errors, suffering, and the price paid in human lives. When we look back at a small, dimly lit alehouse in 12th century England, we see not only the extreme harshness of ancient life, we also clearly see why the standards that we sometimes overlook, even disregard, in the present are so precious and essential. A civilized society cannot be measured solely by bigger houses or cleaner streets. It is also measured by the degree to which people understand what they eat, what they drink, and what is subtly entering their bodies every day. I also believe this story should leave future generations with a very simple, yet profoundly important reminder. Never underestimate the things that repeat daily, just because they are so familiar. A meal, a glass of water, a production process, a hygiene condition, all can become the fragile boundary between survival and harm if people neglect their responsibility to verify and understand. Medieval history has shown that a lack of knowledge not only made life harder, it could also transform an individual's journey of survival into a lifelong gamble. Therefore, if you have listened to this entire story, perhaps the most memorable takeaway is not how dirty the medieval alehouse was, or how resiliently people endured it. What is truly worth imprinting on our hearts and minds is that they had to gamble their lives every single day just to perform the most basic acts any human must: eating and drinking. And when we consider that, it is difficult not to view our present reality with a profound sense of gratitude and a heightened awareness unlike ever before. If you wish to delve deeper into similar hidden corners of history, places where daily life turned out to conceal horrors greater than war itself, then I invite you to continue this journey with me, for there are still many truths from the past that lie not on thrones or blood-soaked battlefields, but right there on the dining table, in the kitchen, in the cup, and within the very things people once believed to be safest.